Imagine a country, a real player on the European stage, vibrant, and then suddenly, it's just gone.
Vanish.
Wiped off the map. No borders, no state for, what, over 100 years?
Yeah, more than a century.
And somehow, against all the odds, it reappears. I mean, how does a nation even survive that? What does that resilience actually look like on the ground?
It's one of history's really big questions, isn't it? It makes you think beyond just, political borders, what actually holds people together.
Exactly. And that's what we're digging into today. We're doing a deep dive into your sources, this history of Poland, to try and unpack that incredible story.
Right.
The really tough times, the surprising high points, and just that enduring spirit that let Poland carry on, even without a formal state.
And the material you gave us sets the scene. Poland, right there in Central Europe, lots of neighbors. Today, EU, NATO, nearly 38 million people. Warsaw's the capital.
Pretty standard stuff on the surface.
But the history, wow. The sources show this 1,000-year saga. Independence, then foreign domination, then independence again. It's quite the roller coaster.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to pull out the really key insights from that history you've studied.
Mm-hmm.
What are the core lessons here about survival, about identity, about, well, what shapes a nation?
Okay, let's get into it.
Right. So going way back, your sources talk about the 6th century AD, early Slavic settlements, especially along the Vistula River.
Yeah, that's the starting point. And then a key group emerges around Gniezno, the Poloni tribe.
The Poloni.
They weren't just any tribe. The sources suggest they were foundational. They ended up giving their name to the whole country, the people, Poland, Poles.
And from them comes the first sort of historically recognized leader, Mieszko I, around 960 AD.
That's the one. The sources credit him with pulling these different Slavic groups together, often through war, let's be honest.
But it wasn't just him deciding to unite everyone, was it? There were outside pressures.
Oh, absolutely. The sources really highlight that context. You've got Christianity spreading from the West, but maybe more critical. In the mid-10th century, you had German expansion happening. Land conquests.
So an external threat.
Exactly. It seems like that external pressure basically forced Mieszko's hand. He had to consolidate these tribes into something stronger, something like a state, just to survive.
Which leads directly to that huge moment your sources pinpoint, 966 AD, the mass baptism. Mieszko's decision.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how the sources frame it. Not just a spiritual thing, not at all.
More political.
Highly political, according to the material. Influenced by advisors, sure, but aimed at preventing internal splits, integrating this new entity. Even though it created new divisions, too, it sort of anchored this early Polish state firmly in the West.
And did that get them noticed internationally?
It seems so. Your sources mention early references pretty quickly after. You see Poland's popping up in Magdeburg in Byzantine writings. There's even stuff like letters to the emperor mentioning Mieszko's widow as the Duchess of Poland.
So they were making their mark, establishing themselves.
Absolutely. It was a foundational move, born from necessity, sealed with this major religious and political choice.
Okay, so moving on from those early Piasts, the sources guide us to a new dynasty, the Jagiellonians. And this looks like a time of major growth, right? A big union.
Yes, this is where Poland links up with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a huge moment. It's initiated by Grand Duke Vytautas. The source calls him Vasilij IV, and the Polish king Władysław II Jagiellonian.
Sealed by that famous marriage, Queen Jadwiga and Jagiello.
That's the one. And a key part of the deal, highlighted in the sources, was Lithuania converting to Christianity, specifically Catholicism.
Right.
And this all leads to the Union of Kryło in 1386. The sources describe it as a permanent union under one crown. And this is important, it wasn't a total merger right away.
Still separate kingdoms.
Yeah, two distinct self-governing kingdoms, two languages, even two currencies, according to the sources. Jagiello had to promise things, baptizing Lithuanians, yes, but also taking on the German order, the Teutonic Knights.
Which inevitably meant war.
Big time. Your sources talk about the bloody conflict with the German order and that major victory at Grunwald. This came after a crusade was declared against the Lithuanians, ironically, right after they converted.
Wow. Quite the turn of events. So Grunwald was a defining moment for this new union.
Huge military triumph. And the Jagiellonians, they ruled for over 2 centuries. Became a really significant European dynasty. Your sources suggest they generally aimed for, well, a kind of peaceful approach within the United States.
Which helped them avoid internal chaos.
Seems so. It helped them sidestep some of the conflicts, tearing apart neighbors, maintain social order, made them stand out a bit.
And this period often gets called Poland's Golden Age, though the sources link it more with the later Vasa kings, Sigismund III, Władysław IV.
Yes, that's generally the association for the peak cultural flourishing, a time of dynastic continuity. Although the sources are clear, it wasn't all peaceful. Definitely. Pressure from Russia, and really significant, often disastrous wars with Sweden, especially under Sigismund III Vasa.
And he's the one who moved the capital.
That's right. From Krakow to Warsaw. Big move.
And the culture during this Golden Age sounds amazing based on your descriptions.
It really was vibrant. The sources talk about Baroque art flourishing, that grand, dynamic, highly ornamented style, often built on Renaissance foundations, creating these incredible palaces and churches.
And Gdańsk plays a big role here.
Huge. It's highlighted as a major center for trade, for culture. The sources even say it rivaled places like Amsterdam and Antwerp at the time.
Really? That's impressive.
Yeah, its wealth fueled this amazing cultural scene. You see it in the art, the architecture, like the massive St. Mary's Church there, and it all reflected the Commonwealth's character, multinational, multi-religious.
So this amazing union, this Golden Age, but that stability didn't last forever. Your sources then detail a period of, well, major turbulence.
Yeah, things start to unravel. This brings us to the Polish Swedish Wars, a whole series of conflicts really spanning the 16th to 18th century.
Fighting over.
Mostly territory and crucially control over the Baltic Sea. Trade routes, power. Your sources even use the Polish term Wielkie Wojny, Great Wars, distinguishing them from lesser conflicts.
And the deluge sounds particularly awful.
It was devastating. The sources described the deluge, 1655 to 1660, as Sweden basically trying to take over the whole Baltic region. Utterly ruthless.
And there were more invasions later.
Another big one in 1700 during the Great Northern War. And what made it worse, according to your sources, were the internal problems. Political infighting between powerful noble families like the Sapieha's and the Czartoryskis.
Weakening the state from within.
Exactly. The sources suggest this internal bickering really paved the way for neighbors to interfere later on.
And that internal weakness plus aggressive neighbors, it leads to what your sources call the unthinkable. The Partitions of Poland.
The absolute catastrophe. 3 times, 1772, 1793, 1795. Russia, the Habsburg monarchy, Prussia, they just carved it up.
And the sources are blunt about it.
Completely. They state unequivocally. The Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was erased from the map of Europe. Just gone.
Do the sources give any reasons why? The motivations?
They do. They mention Frederick II of Prussia wanting Dask, wanting to expand in Pomerania. Catherine the Great of Russia had her eyes on southern lands like Masuria, Sandomierz. Your sources even note the second partition was particularly well organized, a coordinated land grab between Prussia and Russia.
So the state disappears for over a century. Which brings us back to that core question. How did the nation, the people, survive?
And this is maybe the most profound takeaway from your sources. Despite losing the state, the Polish nation endured. It has survived not through political structures, those were gone, but through culture.
Culture.
Yeah, a constant, conscious turning back to their shared heritage, their language, their achievements. The sources argue Poland continued to exist as a community, a cultural reality, even when it had no legal standing internationally.
That's incredible. What was day-to-day life like under occupation in the 19th century, divided between these 3 empires?
The sources describe very different experiences. Prussia, Austria, Russia. They ran things differently, affecting the population, development, everything.
How so?
Well, for instance, the sources suggest education and science actually fared best in the Austrian partition. Conditions were generally toughest, most repressive under Russia.
But didn't wars and uprisings mean they lost a lot of their educated people, their elites?
Oh, definitely. Your sources acknowledge that terrible loss of life and talent. But somehow, they argue, a basis for future national life was preserved, kept alive under the surface. Even though, of course, the laws of the occupying powers were supreme and Polish institutions faded.
And Poland's geography didn't help. Being stuck in the middle.
Precisely, a constant theme in the sources. Poland's position as this geographical bridge put it right in the path of German and Russian ambitions. Constantly caught between these two powerful, often rivalrous neighbors. It's a recurring factor in its history.
Okay, so 123 years wiped off the map. And then 1918.
The turning point. Independence regained. Miraculously, really. Your sources frame it as this remarkable comeback against all odds.
But the period after, the Second Polish Republic, 1918 to 1939, The sources don't exactly paint a rosy picture. They call it a land of contradictions, blossoms, and catastrophes.
Yeah, it faced huge problems. Border wars, trying to stitch a country back together from 3 different partitions, poverty. It was tough.
But there were successes, too.
Oh, yes. The sources also mention impressive economic growth for the time, living conditions improving for many. It was a period of intense struggle, but also real achievement.
And there was a major political shift mentioned in the sources in 1926.
Yes, they describe a military coup. Now, it's interesting. The source material we're using specifically attributes this coup to General Wojciech Jaruzelski.
Jaruzelski in 1926. That seems early for him to be leading a coup.
It does seem chronologically unusual based on general historical understanding, but that is what is stated in this specific source material we are analyzing. The source says this coup ended parliamentary democracy and brought in the Synacha regime.
Okay, so that attribution is directly from this source. And this Synacha government maintained a semblance of democracy.
That's the phrase used in the source, yes. A kind of authoritarian rule, but not completely totalitarian, perhaps.
And their foreign policy, the source mentions that too.
Yes, focused on realism, trying to find allies like France to guard against aggressive neighbors. A pragmatic approach, according to the material.
But pragmatism wasn't enough. World War II arrived.
And it was utterly catastrophic for Poland. Germany invades September 1st, 1939. Your sources detail Poland being militarily outmatched from the start.
And the German occupation policies got progressively worse.
Brutally so. Cautious at first. Then the sources describe a wave of murders targeting Polish elites in 1940. Then this horrifying plan for a colonial regime, the general government, meant for German settlers. And by mid-1943, the sources use the chilling phrase, fun and extermination.
Fun and extermination.
Stark language from the source, reflecting the utter dehumanization. They also recount the tragic crushing of the Warsaw uprisings.
The cost. It's just staggering.
Your sources estimate that by 1944, Poland had lost about 30% of its people and half its pre-war territory. And then the final bitter twist, losing independence again.
Falling into the Soviet sphere.
Exactly. The sources call it an unfathomable tragedy.
And the end of the war wasn't liberation, not really.
Not in the way the West experienced it. The sources are clear. While the UN recognized Poland as democratic, for most Poles, 1945 just meant swapping one occupier for another Stalinist communism controlled by Moscow.
And there was that huge gap between the government in exile in London, which many saw as legitimate.
And the Soviet-backed committee, the PKWN, which became the provisional government. A total disconnect.
The sources talk about a feeling of betrayal. No real hope.
Deeply felt. A sense that Allied promises like those made at Yalta meant nothing. That true independence was impossible.
And the communist system was imposed harshly.
Very harshly. Your sources detail waves of oppression, mentioning brutal torture tactics used by Polish communist interrogators. The system was forced on the country army, police, the dreaded Ministry of Security.
And Soviet influence remained strong.
Absolutely. The sources explicitly mention Soviet troops staying, Soviet agents active, even keeping secret lists, apparently, to track and punish people based on their politics. A grim picture of imposed control.
But out of that darkness, something new started to grow.
Exactly. This is where Solidarność comes in. Your sources show it starting in 1980-1981. Initially, interestingly, as a workers' movement.
Not explicitly political at first.
Not aiming to overthrow the state, initially. More focused on economic reforms, workers' rights within the communist system.
And the Gdańsk Agreement was key.
August 31st, 1980. Huge moment. The government actually recognized the right to form free trade unions. Your sources pinpoint this as the real start of solidarity as a major recognized force.
Led by Lech Walesa, the sources portray him as quite the figure.
Absolutely central. An electrician, peasant background becomes this global symbol. Strike leader, Nobel Peace Prize, eventually president. A truly heroic figure in the narrative presented.
And solidarity just exploded in popularity.
Grew incredibly strong, incredibly fast, which, as your sources state, became a massive threat to the Communist Party's power. They couldn't ignore it.
So the system pushed back.
Hard. Martial law. Declared in December 1981, specifically, the sources say, to crush solidarity.
But it didn't quite work.
That's the crucial point in the sources. They tried to extinguish it, but solidarity went underground, kept organizing discussion groups, networks. The spirit, the idea, survived the repression.
And ultimately, solidarity's struggle, Waliesa's story, it's tied into the bigger picture, the fall of communism itself.
The sources argue quite strongly that the whole process, the crumbling of communism in Eastern Europe, really got its start in Poland with Solidarity in 1980. It showed it was possible.
Which then led to this massive transformation in Poland, modern Poland.
Huge changes. Economy, society, international relations, everything shifted. The economic transition is described as particularly dramatic in your sources.
Successful, bloodless, fast,
Yeah.
effective. That's how the sources put it. Moving from central planning to free market.
Pretty much. They note an initial drop in GDP right after 89, maybe 20%, but then strong, continuous growth from 92 onwards. Poland became a real EU success story, economically speaking, even weathered the global financial crisis relatively well. Privatization was key.
And joining the EU was obviously massive.
Game-changing. Poland shifted from being a big recipient of EU funds to actually contributing in some areas, as the sources note. Foreign policy became firmly based on cooperation within the EU.
The sources mentioned they were effective at negotiating within the EU.
Yeah, effective lobbying, getting funds. And EU membership gives Poland influence, a seat at the table. The sources even talk about potential future roles, like chairing the EU, tackling big issues like terrorism or relations with Russia and the US.
But it's not all smooth sailing now. The sources mention challenges.
They do. They talk about potential failure scenarios, things like financial risks, maybe linked to big EU funds like agricultural subsidies, the CAP. And they also touch on the complexities of the current political scene.
How so?
Well, the source material uses some strong language, mentioning a Potemkin democracy facade with comparisons to Hungary, and concerns about internal political squabbles or sheer stupidity hindering progress. It acknowledges that contemporary Polish politics can be pretty contentious.
Okay, stepping back from the politics for a second. The sources really emphasize cultural contributions throughout Poland's history, don't they?
Oh, hugely important, especially given the periods without statehood. Literature is incredibly rich. The sources mention 4 Nobel laureates: Sienkiewicz, Reymont, Szymborska, Tokarczuk, and Jan Kochanowski as the father of modern Polish poetry.
And theater, too.
Jerzy Grotowski gets a special mention for his really groundbreaking work, his poor theater idea focusing intensely on the actor-audience connection.
Music seems vital as well.
Definitely. Classical composers. Interestingly, the source lists W.A. Mozart alongside the undeniable Polish giants: Chopin, Szymanowski, Moniuszko, who's key for Polish national opera.
Mozart. That's an interesting inclusion in the sources list for Polish music.
It is slightly unexpected in that specific context, but it's listed there in the material alongside the others. The sources also mention performers, violinists, conductors in modern genres like jazz and rock.
And science and technology, too, even during the partitions.
That's another point the sources stress. That scientific work didn't just stop when the state disappeared. Poles kept contributing to global knowledge. The sources call it an extraordinary phenomenon, almost jokingly referring to it as a nation of funny accidents producing top scientists.
And they specifically mention Mendeleev.
Yes, the source credits the Polish-born Mendeleev with devising the periodic table. Again, that specific claim comes from this material.
And woven through all of this history is the Catholic Church. Your sources really highlight its role.
Deeply, deeply significant. There's that phrase cited in the sources: Poland exists where the Catholic Church exists. It speaks volumes about its role as an anchor, an institution that survived everything: partitions, war, communism.
Providing continuity.
Exactly. And crucially, the sources emphasize its vital support for solidarity. That backing was instrumental in the fight for freedom.
And all these threads, the partitions, the struggle, the culture, the church, they all feed into that complex Polish identity the sources discuss.
Very complex, constantly evolving, shaped by trauma, by survival, by those messianic ideas that sometimes emerged, and always defining itself against powerful neighbors, different traditions.
One last point from the sources, a specific foreign policy goal right after World War II.
Yes, they mentioned the Rapacki government saw sorting out the eastern border, the territorial question, as the absolute top priority in the immediate post-war years.
Okay, so pulling this all together, solidarity really stands out in your sources as pivotal for modern Poland.
Absolutely central. The sources portray it as the key driver that led Poland out of communism back to freedom, establishing the Third Republic.
And its character was different, unique.
Very much so, according to the sources. Not like a standard European trade union. It was self-organizing, spontaneous, born inside a communist state. It challenged the ideology itself, using symbols, that universal language of solidarity.
And its ideals left a mark.
Yes, the sources say its core principles are reflected in the Polish constitution: freedom of assembly, trade unions guaranteed, a lasting legacy.
although the sources also mention efforts to downplay its memory.
They do acknowledge that, mentioning attempts, specifically citing the Piast Party in the source material. But then the sources offer this really powerful, almost paradoxical thought.
Solidarity is dead. Long live solidarity.
That quote, attributed in the sources to Beata Zubovic from 2004, it perfectly captures this idea. Solidarity isn't just history you put in a museum or a political slogan someone owns.
It's something more.
It's spirit, the source suggests. That idea of self-organization, of standing up for freedom, it can't be nationalized or controlled. It lives on, maybe in different forms. The idea of solidarity endures.
So after this deep dive through your sources, wow, we've gone from early tribes banding together through this huge Commonwealth and Golden Age, then centuries of being wiped out as a state, surviving wars, communism, and then this incredible resurgence driven by solidarity, leading to modern Poland with all its successes and complexities.
Yeah, the sources lay out a history filled with, immense suffering. But what resonates most strongly is that resilience, that ability of a nation, of a people, to hold on to who they are, their culture, their identity, even without a state. And then channeling that into something as powerful as solidarity to reclaim it.
So thinking about this whole story, Poland's history of disappearing and reappearing, what does it make you wonder about what really makes a nation? About sovereignty in our changing world? Or maybe how does that specific legacy of solidarity continue to shape Poland's path, its challenges, and its opportunities even now? Definitely gives you a lot to chew on.